For more than a century, this narrow strip of land has controlled global trade. It is one of the most important shortcuts ever built, and one of the world's greatest engineering achievements. But today, that shortcut is under pressure like never before. Ships are getting bigger. Global trade is becoming more unpredictable. Droughts have repeatedly reduced the canal's capacity, and every delay sends shockwaves through supply chains across the planet. For countries that depend on this route, relying on a single waterway has become an increasingly expensive gamble. So instead of waiting for Panama to solve the problem, they're trying to go around it. From a massive rail corridor across southern Mexico to a decades-old dream of carving an entirely new canal through Nicaragua, to a 2,400-kilometer highway network stretching across South America, a new race is underway to create the next great trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific. But can any of these megaprojects really challenge one of the most successful infrastructure projects ever built? Or will the Panama Canal remain impossible to replace? Let's find out. Every year, around 14,000 ships line up off the coasts of Panama and wait their turn to pass through a 50-mile cut across the narrowest part of Central America. They carry roughly 5% of all the goods that move across the world's oceans, and the value of what passes through in a year runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The Panama Canal is not the busiest waterway on Earth. The Suez Canal cuts through the Isthmus of Suez, with a channel about 120 miles long, more than twice the length of Panama's 50-mile crossing. It is far wider too, around 675 feet across, against the roughly 180 feet of Panama's newest locks. Where Panama has to lift ships over high ground through a series of locks, Suez runs flat and open at sea level, which lets it take larger ships and move more of them. All of that scale shows up in the trade. Suez carries somewhere around 10 to 12% of all global commerce and close to a third of the world's container traffic, roughly double what moves through Panama. However, Panama punches far above what its size would suggest. Without it, a ship sailing from the east coast of the United States to Asia, or from one American coast to the other, would otherwise have to go all the way around the bottom of South America, a detour of some 8,000 nautical miles that adds weeks to the journey and a fortune in fuel. The canal turns that voyage into a single day of transit, making it one of the most important waterways in the world. The canal is overwhelmingly an American artery. The United States is the origin or the destination for around 72% of all the cargo that passes through it. Goods crossing the Pacific from Asia bound for the ports of the U.S. East Coast, American grain and gas heading out to Asian buyers. Much of it funnels through this one channel. Close to half of all the container traffic moving between Northeast Asia and the eastern United States depends on it. For most Americans, the canal is a line on a map in another country. In practice, it sits underneath a huge share of what they buy and sell. For 100 years, all of this ran seamlessly. The world built its supply chains around the certainty that the passage would always be open. But then, the rain stopped falling, and a problem that had been hiding inside the canal the entire time rose to the surface. The Panama Canal has a vulnerability. The canal doesn't simply let ships sail through at sea level the way Suez does. The land in the middle of Panama sits higher than the oceans on either side, so to get a ship across, the canal lifts it up and over. It floats each vessel into a chamber, fills the chamber with water to raise the ship to the level of a lake, carries it across that lake, and then lowers it back down on the far side by draining the water out again. Every one of those lifts is powered by fresh water flowing downhill. A single ship crossing the canal uses around 50 million gallons of fresh water. All of that water comes from a man-made lake called Gatun, which sits at the heart of the canal and is fed entirely by rainfall. Panama is normally one of the wettest countries on Earth, and for a century, the rain kept the lake full and the ships moving. However, in 2023, a severe drought, worsened by the climate pattern El Niño, dropped the water level in Gatun Lake to historic lows. With less water to spend, the canal had no choice but to ration it, and the only way to ration water was to move fewer ships. Panama slashed the number of daily crossings from its normal 36 down toward 22, and in the worst stretch, it fell to as few as 18. On top of that, it cut how deep the ships could sit in the water, which meant vessels had to carry lighter loads to float higher, leaving cargo behind. Ships backed up for weeks waiting to cross. Companies desperate to get through paid enormous sums in auctions for the few available slots, with some single crossings auctioned for millions of dollars on top of the normal toll. A passage the world had always treated as reliable suddenly wasn't. The Panama Canal was no longer enough, and suddenly governments started dusting off plans that had sat on shelves for decades. Plans to offer a different route. And at the forefront of this push is Mexico, with an ambitious $18 billion megaproject called the Interoceanic Corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, or CIIT. The reason Mexico can even attempt to rival Panama comes down to the shape of the country. In Mexico's deep south, the land narrows to its slimmest point at a place called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where about 140 miles separate the Gulf of Mexico on the Atlantic side from the Pacific on the other. That is wider than the 50-mile pinch at Panama, but it is the narrowest crossing anywhere in Mexico. It is low enough that no towering mountains block the way, and crucially, it sits far closer to the United States than Panama does. For anyone trying to move cargo between the two oceans without the long haul down to Central America, this thin strip of southern Mexico has always been the obvious place to do it. The Spanish conquistadors went looking for a natural strait here in the 16th century. When they failed to find one, the idea of building a crossing across the isthmus never really went away, and one man eventually made it real. That man was Porfirio Diaz, the general who ruled Mexico for more than 3 decades around the turn of the 20th century. Diaz built his rule on modernizing the country through foreign investment, covering Mexico in railways, ports, and industry financed by outside money. The crossing of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec became the single most expensive and most ambitious engineering project of his entire presidency. He wanted a railway that would carry the trade of the world across Mexico's narrowest point, linking the Pacific to the Atlantic, and turning Mexico into a hinge of global commerce. The obvious partner for a project like this was the United States, Mexico's giant neighbor to the north, whose money and engineers were already spreading through the country. Diaz deliberately did not choose the Americans. He was wary of U.S. power and determined not to hand Washington control over something as strategically valuable as an interoceanic route across his country. So instead, he turned to the British. Diaz awarded the contract to a London engineering firm run by Wheatman Pearson, a British contractor who had already built major works in Mexico and who was close to the Diaz government. Leaning on the British to build the railway was a calculated act of balance, a way to get the crossing built while keeping it out of American hands and using one great power as a counterweight against another. Pearson's firm rebuilt the line from a half-finished failure into a working railway, and along with it, dredged and constructed the 2 ports at either end, Salina Cruz on the Pacific and Coatzacoalcos on the Gulf. In January 1907, Diaz inaugurated the completed Tehuantepec National Railway, 7 years before a single ship would pass through the Panama Canal, and it worked. Cargo poured onto the line. At its peak, the 188-mile-long railway ran as many as 60 trains a day across the isthmus, hauling goods that had come off ships on one coast to be loaded onto ships on the other. The 2 port cities that Pearson had built grew into busy, prosperous towns on the strength of the traffic. For a few years, Diaz had a Mexican crossing of the oceans built by a chosen foreign partner, carrying the trade of the world across Mexican soil. But it wasn't long before this immensely successful megaproject started losing its shine. In 1910, Mexico erupted into a decade of violent upheaval that toppled Diaz and threw the country into chaos. The railway that depended on stability and order suffered badly, its operations disrupted, its traffic thrown into doubt, the line at points taken over and used by the military as the country tore itself apart. The The second blow came in 1914 when the Panama Canal opened and offered shippers a seamless voyage straight through Central America with no need to unload and reload across a strip of land. Between the canal drawing the trade south and the revolution making Mexico unstable and dangerous, the railway collapsed. Cargo volume fell by a third, and within a year, it had dropped by nearly 80%. The line that had been the crowning project of Diaz's Mexico fell into disrepair and decline, and the prosperity it had brought to the Isthmus drained away with the traffic. The crossing was left to rust, a national ambition undone by revolution at home and a canal abroad. For most of a century, the Isthmus stayed poor. The railway rusted, the ports faded, and the states it ran through, Oaxaca and Veracruz, remained among the poorest in Mexico. Successive governments floated plans to revive the crossing, and none of them went anywhere. In the meantime, the pressure on the Panama Canal became impossible to ignore. Ships were getting bigger than the locks could handle. Traffic was rising, and the water problem was starting to show itself in bad years. For the first time in a century, the world's shippers had a reason to wonder what they would do if Panama ever faltered, and Mexico finally answered the question. Andrés Manuel López Obrador won the presidency in 2018 on a promise to develop Mexico's neglected south. The Tehuantepec crossing became one of 3 flagship projects for that region, alongside the Maya train and the Dos Bocas refinery. What they set out to build goes beyond a railway system or a canal. It's an entire logistics system laid across the isthmus. The government formally approved it in June 2019, and construction began on 7th June 2020. The first job was to rebuild the old railway where freight trains now moved at around 12 miles an hour. The new target was to take it up to 44. Crews stripped and rebuilt 130 miles of the old line between Coatzacoalcos and Salina Cruz. 82 railway bridges were rebuilt, and 290 separate drainage works were installed to stop the tropical rains from washing the roadbed out. By 2022, they had double-tracked sections of the route and started load testing. While the track went down, the ports were being rebuilt. From 2021, crews at Salina Cruz and Coatzacoalcos dredged the access channels to a depth of 12 meters and began building multimodal terminals designed for moving cargo directly between ships and trains. Freight service on the main line started on August 28, 2023. Passenger service followed in September. On December 22, 2023, the rebuilt Coatzacoalcos-Salina Cruz Railway was formally completed and fully operational. That old line, designated Line Z, is the spine, but it isn't the whole system. A second line, FA, runs from Coatzacoalcos east to Palenque and ties into the Maya train network. A third, Line K, runs 285 miles from Ixtepec down toward the Guatemalan border, opening a route towards Central America. Its first section was inaugurated in November 2025, and the rest is due in mid-2026. Altogether, the network runs to more than 750 miles of track. At either end, the ports are being rebuilt. Salina Cruz and Coatzacoalcos are both being dredged deeper and fitted with new terminals designed specifically for moving containers between ship and train. 2 more ports at Puerto Chiapas and Dos Bocas are being folded into the network, but the whole megaproject does not stop at moving cargo. The idea is that goods won't just pass through the isthmus, they'll be made there. That's the bet underneath the whole project. Mexico isn't only trying to build a shortcut between 2 oceans, it's trying to use that shortcut to drag one of the poorest regions in the country into the global manufacturing economy. The total investment runs to around $6 billion from the Mexican government, with another $2 billion coming from international lenders. While the construction continues to go from strength to strength, it hasn't all been plain sailing. The region that CIIT runs through covers 105 municipalities across 4 states and roughly 4.6 million people, most of them in places that have seen almost no industrial investment in living memory. The government's pitch is jobs, wages, and a permanent shift in what southern Mexico produces. However, not everyone is on board. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec is home to 11 indigenous nations, and much of the land is held under communal title rather than individual ownership. That land is what the corridor needs. The railway runs across it, and the industrial parks have to be built on it, which means the communal holdings that have defined life in the isthmus for generations have to be broken up and transferred. The government says it consulted indigenous communities before building on their territory. However, communities and independent observers say the consultations were rushed, poorly organized, and structured to produce approval rather than a genuine effort to get consent. Resistance built through blockades, protests, and lawsuits, most of it barely covered in Mexico City. In January 2024, 9 Zapotec residents of Santa Maria Mixtequilla were arrested. Human rights organizations documented at least 46 separate attacks on people opposing the corridor between 2021 and early 2024, attributed variously to state police, the National Guard, private security, and organized crime. The Isthmus is also one of the most biodiverse places in Mexico, and a lot of it has been cleared for this mega project. Despite the opposition, successive governments have powered through CIIT, and Mexico now stands to gain big in the economic sense. Mexico's approach was to build around the canal rather than replace it. A decade earlier, a country just south of it tried the opposite. Nicaragua set out to beat Panama at its own game with a bigger canal. For most of the 19th century, when Americans imagined a canal through Central America, they pictured it running through Nicaragua rather than Panama. The country has Lake Nicaragua sitting across it, with an enormous stretch of the crossing already existing as navigable water. It is the largest body of fresh water in Central America, and before there was the Panama Canal, the U.S. came incredibly close to choosing it. However, the Senate voted for Panama by a margin of 8 votes, and the shortcut that would reshape global trade for the next century went to a different country. The dream never fully died. It resurfaced every few decades in surveys and proposals that went nowhere until it landed in front of a government willing to act on it. By 2013, Daniel Ortega had been back in the presidency for 6 years. The former Sandinista revolutionary had spent that time consolidating power, filling the courts and the National Assembly with loyalists, and Nicaragua remained one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere. A canal offered the kind of transformation nothing else could, and Ortega went looking for someone to build it. The man who came forward was Wang Jing. He was a Chinese businessman who had made his money in telecommunications, running a company that sold phone services across dozens of countries, and he had never built anything remotely like a canal. He had no background in civil engineering, no experience in dredging or heavy construction, and no track record in infrastructure of any kind. His company, HKND Group, was registered in Hong Kong and had been created specifically for this project. In June 2013, Ortega stood beside Wang in Managua and announced the deal. The concession handed HKND the exclusive right to build and operate a canal across the entire width of Nicaragua, to run it for 50 years, and to extend that for another 50 after. The legislation authorizing it, known as Law 840, moved through the National Assembly in a matter of days. It went on to become the most legally challenged law in the country's history, drawing more than 40 separate constitutional appeals, and every one of them was thrown out by the Supreme Court Ortega controlled. What the law described dwarfed the canal to the south. The Nicaraguan route would run 278 kilometers, more than 3 times the length of the Panama Canal, and it would be dug to nearly twice the depth, wide and deep enough to carry the enormous container ships that Panama could not handle even after its expansion. HKND put the cost at $50 billion, a figure several times larger than Nicaragua's entire annual economic output. And because a waterway alone would not turn a poor country into a center of global trade, the concession went further. It gave HKND the right to build an airport, 2 deepwater ports at either end of the canal, an oil pipeline, and a free trade zone where goods could be manufactured and processed as they moved through. Ortega promised the project would bring hundreds of thousands of jobs and lift the country out of poverty. HKND called it the largest construction project in the history of the human race. Throughout all of it, Wang insisted he was acting entirely on his own, a private businessman with no connection to the Chinese government. That claim sat at the center of the whole affair because a Chinese-controlled canal in Nicaragua would not have been an ordinary business venture. The Panama Canal is the artery of American trade and a passage the U.S. Navy relies on to move between oceans, and Washington has treated Central America as its own strategic ground since the days of the Monroe Doctrine. A second canal, larger than Panama's and operated for a century by a Chinese company, would have handed Beijing physical control over one of the most important choke points in the Western Hemisphere. It would have been the single largest Chinese strategic presence ever established in America's backyard. U.S. officials raised the question publicly of where Wang's money was really coming from, and the structure of his financing did nothing to settle it. The funds ran through 16 shell companies registered in tax havens, including the Netherlands and the Cayman Islands, an arrangement that made the true source impossible to trace. The route ran straight through Lake Nicaragua, and that decision carried consequences. The lake is the largest freshwater reserve in Central America and the drinking supply for a substantial share of the country's population. Cutting a shipping channel across it meant dredging a deep trench through the middle of the water and running the largest vessels afloat back and forth across it, and scientists warned the salt and the sediment and the traffic could poison the lake beyond recovery. The route also cut through protected rainforest that was home to more than 20 endangered species. Then there were the people living along it. Estimates put the number who would be forced off their land at around 120,000, including Rama and Creole communities on the Caribbean coast, whose territory is protected under Nicaraguan law. The concession gave HKND sweeping power to seize land anywhere along the route, and across the countryside, farmers who had worked their ground for generations found themselves standing in the path of a canal they had never been asked about. They fought it. Over the following years, Nicaraguan farmers organized around 100 separate marches against the concession, one of the largest sustained protest movements the country had seen in decades. As the resistance grew, Ortega's government met it with force. In 2019, a judge handed 3 of the farmer leaders who had led the protests prison sentences of 216 years, 210 years, and 159 years, convicting them on charges of promoting a failed coup. While all of this played out, the canal itself was going nowhere. HKND held a ceremonial groundbreaking in December 2014, and crews cut a few access roads near the route, but digging on the waterway never began. The contract contained a clause that would dissolve the concession if Wang failed to raise the money within 72 months, and he never came close. In 2015, the Chinese stock market crashed, and Wang lost the overwhelming majority of his personal fortune almost overnight, taking with it any credibility he had as the financier of a $50 billion canal. HKND quietly closed its offices, and its staff drifted away. The project stayed alive on paper for another decade, a law on the books authorizing a canal that no one was building. In May 2024, Nicaragua's National Assembly repealed Law 840 and canceled the concession outright. The vote was unanimous. Nothing was ever dug. What the Nicaragua Canal left behind was a decade of land seizures. A protest movement answered with prison sentences longer than any human life, and a demonstration of how quickly Chinese money moving into Central America turns into a problem for Washington. Ortega's government has said it remains open to reviving the canal with new partners, and China's appetite for a route it controls has not disappeared. It has only moved south. South America's largest economy, Brazil, and its richest farmland sit on the Atlantic side of the continent, looking toward Europe and Africa. But its biggest customer is on the other side of the planet. China buys enormous quantities of what South America produces, and the single largest flow is Brazilian soybeans and iron ore, hundreds of millions of tons of it every year, feeding Chinese livestock and Chinese steel mills. Almost all of Brazil's cargo takes the long way. More than 90% of Brazil's exports leave from the Atlantic coast and sail east, either around the bottom of Africa or up through the Panama Canal, a journey of many thousands of miles. The continent has the Andes between its heartland and the Pacific, a wall of mountains that has kept its trade pointed in the wrong direction for as long as it has been exporting anything. The idea that has resurfaced to fix this is a railway across the continent, a bioceanic corridor running from the Atlantic coast of Brazil, across the width of South America, over the Andes, and down to the Pacific, a route that would let Brazilian cargo reach China by crossing the land to the near ocean instead of sailing around the far one. What made the idea suddenly credible was a port. In November 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping inaugurated a deep-water port at Chancay on the Pacific coast of Peru, about 70 kilometers north of Lima. It was built at a cost of around $3.5 billion, most of it Chinese money, and it is majority-owned and operated by COSCO, the Chinese state shipping company, which holds a 60% stake. Chancay is deep enough to take the largest container ships afloat, vessels that could never fit through the Panama Canal, and it was built for one purpose: to be the western gateway for South American goods heading to Asia. From Chancay, a ship can reach China in around 23 days, cutting as much as 10 days off the current route. While the port is already up and running, the corridor that is supposed to feed it is yet to be finalized. On the Brazilian side, the plan is to link two railways already under construction, the FIOL and the FICO, which would connect the Atlantic port of Ilhéus to the farmlands of the interior, with completion expected around 2028. From there, the route would push west through the states of Rondônia and Acre to the Peruvian border, then across Peru and over the Andes to Chancay. Depending on the route, the full corridor runs somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000 miles. The problem is the middle, the stretch from the Brazilian interior to the Peruvian border, which makes up nearly half of the Brazilian portion of the corridor, exists only as a line on a map. There is no actual project for it, no route surveyed, no construction begun. Less than 15% of the Brazilian track is ready, and the hardest part of all still lies beyond it, because the railway would then have to cross the Andes, climbing to elevations approaching 4,800 meters, some of the most difficult terrain on Earth to build a railway through. The terrain also poses an economic challenge, leading to question marks over whether the corridor makes sense at all. The cargo it is meant to carry is soybeans and iron ore, cheap bulk goods, where the entire business depends on moving vast tonnage at the lowest possible cost. But hauling that freight up and over the Andes is punishing. Trucks that can carry 55 tons on flat ground are limited to around 27 tons in the mountains. Every transfer between train and truck and ship adds cost, delay, and handling. Brazilian soybean producers have been openly skeptical, pointing out that the time saved crossing the Pacific could easily be swallowed by the cost and difficulty of getting the cargo across the continent to reach it in the first place. Then there is what the route would cross. A railway pushing west from the Brazilian interior toward Peru would run through the Amazon, threatening to cut a transport corridor through some of the most sensitive rainforest and indigenous territory on the planet, opening it to exactly the kind of development that has followed roads and railways across the Amazon before. And running underneath all of it is the same geopolitical question that surrounded Nicaragua, now stretched across a continent. The corridor and the port that anchors it are, in large part, a Chinese project. Chancay is Chinese-owned and Chinese-operated. The railway financing is Chinese. The whole route is designed to bind South America's resources more tightly to China while routing them away from the sea lanes the United States has traditionally dominated. The MOU Brazil and China signed for the railway raised open concern in the region about sovereignty and strategic autonomy, about how much control a foreign power would hold over the infrastructure carrying a continent's exports. Peru's own government was careful to note it had not formally committed to the railway and was not part of the initial agreement. The result is the most ambitious of all the alternatives to Panama and the least finished. A world-class port already operating on the Pacific coast, waiting for a railway across South America that, for the most part, does not yet exist and may not for decades. It is less a plan to replace the Panama Canal than a bet that China's hunger for South American soybeans and iron ore is permanent enough to justify moving a mountain range to reach it. Whether these Panama Canal alternates will work or not remains a question for the future. In the meantime, the Panama Canal route is already expanding to protect it from a future challenge. While the world builds routes around it, the Panama Canal is not standing still. It has spent the last 2 decades rebuilding itself, and it is spending billions more to fight the natural phenomenon setting it back. The reconstruction began with a new set of locks. The canal's original locks, dug in the early 1900s, were too small for the ships the world had started building. A modern container vessel simply could not fit, and every year, more of the largest ships bypassed Panama because the canal couldn't take them. So Panama built a third set of locks alongside the old ones, a 9-year effort that cost around $5.25 billion. The new chambers are enormous, 70 feet wider and 18 feet deeper than the originals, sized for ships the industry calls Neo-Panamax, that carry over twice the cargo of the largest vessels the old locks could handle. It was the last great construction project on the Panama Canal that opened in 2016 and doubled the canal's capacity in a single stroke. The engineers who designed those new locks understood the canal's deepest vulnerability, and they built the solution directly into the concrete. The canal runs on fresh water. Every ship that passes is lifted and lowered by water draining out of Gatun Lake. And in the original locks, all of that water flows straight out to sea once it has done its job. A single transit through the old locks uses around 150 gallons of fresh water, gone into the ocean with every vessel. The new locks were built with water-saving basins, a set of auxiliary chambers beside each lock that capture a large share of the water from each transit and reuse it on the next ship instead of dumping it. The system recycles about 60% of the water used in each lockage. A transit that would have consumed 500 million liters of fresh water in the old locks uses closer to 200 million in the new ones. It was a remarkable piece of foresight. It was also not enough. The expansion solved the size problem and eased the water problem, but it did not solve either one for good. The biggest container ships now being built have already outgrown even the Neo-Panamax locks, and they sail other routes because Panama still cannot take them. The canal that had just spent 9 years getting bigger was once again chasing a shipping industry that kept building larger. And the water problem came back with a force the water-saving basins could not absorb. When the drought struck in 2023, recycling 60% of each transit's water made no difference if the lake feeding the whole system was running dry. The canal was forced to cut transits and lighten shiploads regardless of how efficient the new locks were. The expansion had made the canal drink less. It had not made the rain fall. The constraint had moved. It was no longer the size of the locks. It was the water to fill them. That is what Panama is building now, and it is a very different kind of project from the locks. The plan is to dam the Rio Indio, a river that runs through the hills near the canal, and create an entirely new reservoir to hold fresh water in reserve. The reservoir would be connected to Gatun Lake by a tunnel roughly 5 miles long, bored through the hills, allowing the stored water to flow by gravity into the canal's system whenever the lake runs low. The main structure is a dam of roller-compacted concrete, backed by several auxiliary dams, holding a reservoir of around 1.25 billion cubic meters of water. The payoff is straightforward. In a dry season, the reservoir would let up to 15 additional ships pass through the canal each day, water that would otherwise not exist, and it would secure drinking water for the surrounding population for decades. The projected cost is around $1.6 billion. Construction is scheduled to begin in 2027 and finish by 2032. The dam is Panama's real answer to everything being built around it, and it comes with a clock attached. The reservoir will not be finished until 2032 at the earliest. Forecasters expect the next drought-driving El Niño to arrive as soon as 2027, years before the dam can hold a drop of water. The canal recovered from the last drought when the rains returned in 2025, and by early 2026, Gatun Lake was so full the authority was releasing water to prevent flooding. But that reprieve was weather, not engineering, and the underlying problem is unchanged. Panama is in a race between the water it is building to store and the next dry year that will test whether it built it fast enough. Despite all the projects rising around it, the canal remains extraordinarily hard to replace. And the reason comes down to what the alternatives can and cannot actually do. Why Panama still wins. Mexico's CIIT is already operational. It is moving cargo across the Isthmus and sits closer to the United States. It has arrived at the moment American companies are pulling their supply chains nearer to home. But its ambitions are measured. The Mexican government frames the corridor as capturing around 10% of the trade demand from the U.S. East and Midwest. That is a meaningful share and a growing one, but it is a slice of the traffic, not a replacement for the canal. Panama, meanwhile, stays full. The canal continues to move thousands of ships a year, each carrying thousands of containers, a volume no railway can match. A land route can take a portion of the cargo, but it cannot move ships, and it cannot move the tonnage a waterway moves. It also remains the easier and cheaper option on its most important route. A ship crossing Panama sails through with its cargo still aboard, while a land bridge has to unload every container, cross the land by rail, and load it onto a second ship. For cargo moving between Asia and the U.S. East Coast, using Panama rather than routing through the Suez Canal can cut total transport costs by more than 20%. For most of what passes through, the canal is still the most direct and most cost-efficient path between the oceans. The other rivals continue to lag. The Nicaragua Canal collapsed into nothing. The Bioceanic corridor across South America is a finished port on the Pacific coast, waiting on a railway that mostly does not yet exist and may not for decades. So the alternatives are real, and more keep emerging. But for now, they take the edges of the trade rather than the center of it. Panama remains the most important transit between the two oceans. Carrying the cargo, it is best suited to move while the world builds routes around it to handle the rest. So the Panama Canal isn't disappearing. But for the first time in generations, countries across the Americas are building serious alternatives because global trade has become too important to depend on a single route. And if the next shipping revolution is already underway, the biggest winner may be the country that figures out how to go around it. What are your thoughts on megaprojects bidding to replace the Panama Canal? Does Mexico stand a chance to replace it? Comment your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our documentary on the 4 megaprojects under construction to replace the Strait of Hormuz. Keep following SIGNUM for more fascinating stories from the world's biggest megaprojects.